So, Jennifer, I'd just like to return to that discussion we started before your talk, which was excellent, and thank you very much. It's a big report and complicated, and that helped me to come to grips with what it's really all about, so thank you very much.
Thanks.
Just as a lead into this, what proportion of education spending for primary and secondary education is provided by the federal government directly to students through the student grant program and otherwise, and what proportion is funded by the states, albeit from Commonwealth grants?
It depends. Do you mean to government schools or non-government schools?
The total sector.
Total
Total
sector?
education sector.
It's around about the proportion, so it's about 30 to 70, I think.
I guess I just don't understand the whole concept for this review, because this is primarily a state responsibility where the Commonwealth doesn't have much opportunity to legislate. In fact, really its only power is to either give people money or persuade. And in the context of whether this review is going to actually result in action, it seems to me that really Gonski had no choice but to suggest that more money be given. That was really the only thing that he could do, because that's the only thing the Commonwealth can do, and this is a Commonwealth review. So I just don't really understand what the political dynamics are here, and how these recommendations can be implemented in the context of, pretty stringent budgetary constraint.
I think it was clear, particularly from a federal level, that there was not a lot of, well, there certainly wasn't any consistency between the way that schools are being funded around the different states and territories. And it was miring the education debate in this argument between public and private, and also then between individual schools. I don't read it as a way for the federal government to get its hands on school education. I think that, if you can believe what they've said, is that that's not the intention, and I certainly don't read it like that. Rather, it's trying to sit outside where the states are and recommend a national approach, even if it's not nationally implemented. They talk about, we'll devise something that's consistent, but then we'll allow the states then to pursue that how they want to. I mean, I don't think that the $5 billion is necessary, and I think it was a bit of a shame that price tag was put on the reform, because that's where the attention has gone, and I hope it's not going to be a stumbling block.
If I can just add to that and ask a question too. I mean, one of the issues, and I'm not having looked at the report at all, is, and it's the same with some of the other big spending components of governments everywhere, is about the reform at the school sector, the microeconomic reform, if you like, to get greater. You did mention efficiency in there, and shoving another $5 billion on top of it is not going to deal with that really very real problem. And I don't know if it's politically going to be possible for, particularly in the state sector, for these sorts of reforms to happen. I think in the individual independent schools, there's a lot of, if you like, efficiencies going, attempted because they have to. And as I fear that, let's say the $5 billion is used, or is suddenly spent or materialises from somewhere, that it won't come to grips with the need to reform at that sort of micro level.
Yeah, it assumes that every single dollar is being spent well in every single school at the moment, and I don't think that anyone can argue that case. I'm sure there are efficiencies that might be realised by a more transparent funding system, coupled with a lot of deregulation and devolution to schools themselves to spend the money how they best see fit. You can think of lots of examples of things that have come up in the media from time to time of enormous amounts of money that are wasted through central planning of spending in state education systems, and they're just small examples.
I'm involved in the disabled sector a little, but I'm also generally involved in life, and I've read what I can in the newspapers about the Gonski report, and I'm still not clear about who is driving the need for reform. What's the context, political context, does this come up with? and who are the champions who are going to take this reform through. And I just think at the moment it's out there in the ether, and there's nothing that I, as an ordinary taxpayer, can get my teeth into to say it's good, bad or indifferent. And I don't understand that. Now, I'm involved in the NDIS program, and John Delabosca is heading that up. He's the champion. It's a well-organised program, and we've got a fair way along the track. But that's because it's an organised movement to reform. Very significant movement, but this is perhaps a more significant movement in the terms of education reform. And any parent is involved in education. And I haven't got a feeling that the parents or the schools are, as one unified body, politically pushing to have this approved. And as I'd agree with you, that say $5 billion, you mentioned that sort of figure in NDIS or to Joe Hockey, the Lib Coalition put their hands up, so no, we can't afford it. It is so negative by just having that's a distraction. And so it's just badly sold, I think, whatever's going on here.
I think one of the things underlying this this funding reform is not basically, or not essentially about funding itself. It's about a funding system that supports parent choice and that allows there to be a bit more transparency and understanding in the community about the way schools are funded. There's a lot of misunderstanding, and that's because of the way that, particularly in New South Wales, the way schools are funded is just completely incomprehensible. There's no way anyone could pull apart and say, well, this school is getting this amount of money because they have greater needs than another school. It's very uneven and very inequitable. So there are schools receiving lower amounts of funding who really would be entitled to larger amounts if you were really funding on student need. So there's that, but as I said, also the drive for choice and for autonomy. And I think you need to reform funding to make it student-centred initially, and then school-centred beyond that, so that you can have a funding system that's portable, that people can take the money to which they're entitled for their children's education to whichever school they want to, and they know how much that is. They know how much they're entitled to, and the schools have a lot more stability in their funding as well.
Hi, as usual, your talk is excellent. Now, my question is not so much on the funding, because I feel funding is, if I look at it, kind of input side of the things. What we really are concerned is the outcomes, right? And what outcomes can you expect if, let's say, we spent $5 billion? Now, is it going to be something very vague and qualitative, saying that our kids will be better in science, maths, and reading? These are the three areas he even compares in one of the tables. And this is where many other countries in Asia, and I think even Finland, they are ahead of us, significantly ahead of us. Now, will this $5 billion help us close the gap? Now, he doesn't clearly say that, and I doubt whether it will. So
There's
what do
no
you think?
guarantee of that. There is no direct link between funding levels and student performance levels. That's not to say that the quantum of funding has no relevance to student performance. Obviously, it needs to be sufficient. But beyond the level of sufficiency and beyond providing extra resources for children that clearly need them, there's no way that you can link outcomes with performance. It's
But
about how the money is spent.
Are there any benchmarks that you know, let's say from 3 years from now, in the international comparison, we will be that close to those group of countries, etc. Otherwise, in 3 years from now, we will still be behind those countries. For the simple reason, in those countries, academic achievement is an obsession. Is an obsession.
Yes.
Probably not a good thing, as many will say here. I know sports obsession in Australia is likewise an obsession. So I just want to know whether Gonski gave some benchmarks so that we can know, all right, this is where we were when we started with the whole thing, and this is where we are 3 years from now, and so we are heading in the right direction. Without that, it's all qualitative. Somebody can say, yeah, we have done wonderfully well. We can't do better than those countries because, their teaching is considered a very prestigious profession, whereas in Australia, sports is. I mean, how do we know we are getting there if we spend this money, according to Gonski?
At the moment, it's purely aspirational. I mean, this report deals only with the allocation of funding. It doesn't really deal with how that translates into changes in schools with regards to teacher quality, with regards to curriculum, with regards to anything really that happens within school. It just talks about changing the way that schools are funded, and which hopefully is part of the process that leads to greater decentralisation of schools to allow them to get on with the job.
I like you said hopefully. That's all there is.
I would suspect that even Gonski would realise that throwing $5 billion won't increase educational outcomes, and it's a shame that figure was mentioned because of all the practical reasons, and it's just not going to happen. I would suspect that came from the requirement that no school loses the dollar of funding, and if you look at the terms of reference, that's not actually mentioned as one of the terms of reference. So I believe if you're going to come up with a funding model, you'll start with the greens, a clean sheet.
Yes.
And to start with a requirement that nobody's going to lose, I mean, it must compromise the report. It's got to. So I would suspect that he knows. And the Grattan report, etc., is saying that, throwing money at something will not make our kids smarter. The money or the effort has to go into teacher quality and teacher training and teacher mentoring. It's
Which,
quite obvious.
To be fair, is expensive. There are trade-offs, so it's very difficult to improve teacher quality in the way that the Grattan report suggests, without trading it off against expenditure in other areas. So where those school systems have improved teacher quality through mentoring and releasing teachers from class time, they've had that trade-off by having larger classes. Right, so you can't, the pot isn't an endless pot. There are decisions to be made about what's a more important way to spend the education budget.
There doesn't seem to be any evidence that smaller class sizes increase educational outcomes.
No, that's right.
So,
that's right.
what are we pushing that barrow?
It's popular with parents.
Also the teachers. To get more teachers employed.
That's right, popular with parents and teachers, but essentially that's what it boils down to, and a misunderstanding of the evidence around class sizes as well. But the $5 billion, I think, has partly, as you say, to do with that funding, that guarantee of no school losing a dollar, but also it's to do with the loadings for disadvantage. They just seem to be quite arbitrary, the loadings that they've suggested, and I think probably an overestimate of what would be necessary. From my reading of the report, that it's largely to do with redressing disadvantage and putting extra resources into those schools.
Hi, I haven't read the report, but on the one hand, Gonski seems to be saying there should be a national system of funding which is student-centred, but on the other hand, he's saying that if the states want to maintain system funding, they should do that. Now, that seems intellectually incoherent to me. Is that being unfair?
No, I think there's a conundrum there. Part of the problem at the moment, part of the reason for needing reform is that there are just such strange calculations going on in the way that schools are funded in some state systems that are to do with teacher seniority, teacher employment practices, so congregations of senior teachers in particular schools who are of course more highly paid, and that increases the funding to those schools, and they tend to be the schools who need senior teachers the least. So I think there's definitely a paradox working there that needs to be acknowledged when they start looking at the modelling and looking at how will this actually be implemented in terms of individual schools themselves. Will individual schools actually be better off under this scheme?
Jennifer, in England or Britain, I gather there's a piece of legislation called the Academies Act, which allows state schools, in effect, to declare themselves independent and receive direct funding from the national government.
Yes.
I take it from what you're saying that the Gonski review doesn't seem to anticipate or expect any such reforms here.
It doesn't deal with that. That's part of another process, the Empowering Local Schools process, which is working, it's building towards larger numbers of government schools being able to operate relatively autonomously. So like the schools in WA, there's a 120, is it, Kevin? Do you know? 120 schools in WA who are doing just that. There are still some ways in which they're tied to the state government's practices, particularly with regards to teachers and teacher hiring and teacher firing, essentially, and they're still tied to state curriculums to a large extent, but they're financially they've got a lot more autonomy. But no, it's not really dealt with in the Gonski report.
Sure.
Jennifer, my question is this. I don't see what else Gonski could have come up with, and unless perhaps there were many. He's working within... it seems, as you've said, that a key function of the report was to deal with equity and to try and redress that, and to deal with disability and redress that. He then works within the constraint of not taking any money from anyone. How else do you deal with it other than finding a new pot of money and ensuring that that is split in a very different way to the way in which the existing pot is split? That's what I don't.
I'm not saying that there should be not an extra dollar cent spent at all, but what I'm saying is that figure is just, it comes from nowhere. After the modelling is done, it might have been $1 billion, which is, it's still a lot of money, but it's a heck of a lot different to $5 billion. So we just don't really know at this point what would be an appropriate amount to add to existing funding levels in order to ease this transition through. Not really.
Andrew Waite's my name. I should just say I worked on I'm from the Outland Consulting Group. I worked on the report on the schooling resource standard. One of the things you mentioned about concerns about how reference schools are identified and using that plan for doing that. And I guess we always said it was a very much a preliminary approach based upon what is currently available nationally.
Yeah.
I'm just wondering what you mentioned some concerns you may have had about that, and I guess we're trying to think. We're thinking at the time, well, this is what we can do now, and what's in the pipeline for new data in the future. I just wonder if you had any ideas about what other sort of data could be used in the future for identifying, just for people's background. Reference schools, we sort of thought were a way of identifying benchmark schools, which are sort of achieving national goals of schooling and so forth, which could be then used to identify what are the minimum resource requirements.
Yeah, and I don't necessarily share the reservations about using reference schools and NAPLAN data. I, as you do, think that's probably the simplest and probably the best data that we have available at the moment. As you say, preliminary, but there is some concern, particularly within the Catholic school sector, independent school sector, about the choice of schools that will be used to reference schools, that they may not be representative of schools across the board, and so therefore may they never say it might underestimate or overestimate, but they think that it will end up with a resource standard that's too low, is essentially the fear, and the same with NAPLAN. They see it as a narrow set of data to judge a school by. I don't necessarily share those concerns. I think a simpler approach is generally better in the long run. Just while the microphone's going around to Robert, I'll just add to that. I guess the point I was making is that everyone has to buy into this school resource standard. So it has to allay a lot of those concerns because that's what everything else rests upon.
Is there any potential discussion about integrating the Gonski report with other discussions of educational quality, teacher quality, and those sort of questions that have also been raised here tonight that aren't actually within the remit of the Gonski report?
Sorry, well, I didn't quite hear the first part.
Are there any discussions of potential future reports that aim to address educational quality?
Yeah, I think that's what there are other programs being undertaken, particularly by the federal government via the COAG process, that deal with the devolution of schools and making schools more autonomous, and also the teacher quality issue. I don't, particularly on the teacher quality program, I'm not convinced that that's the right way to go about it. I'm not saying that they're effective programs, but they are being sort of dealt, well, that process has started already. So I don't think there's any talk of inquiries or reports or reviews of those.
Quick question as to what happens next with the report. Who has to approve it? Does the education industry approve it, or does people just get up and talk about it, or what goes then?
Well,
then when they've all talked about it, where does it go next? Does it go, in a filing cabinet somewhere, or?
Yeah. Well, it may well become a dust gatherer. I guess essentially it depends on the government of the day. It depends on whether or not the minister and the Prime Minister decide to pursue this particular reform, and then it has to be done, as Roger pointed out, with the cooperation of the states, because the state is education is largely a state function. They can't go it alone. So there's still quite a long process involved.
And don't they try and enrol the parents or the schools, or where does the political groundwork come from to make this thing roll forward and stop it going into a dust pile? Or isn't that anticipated?
I guess that it will be up to the government of the day to decide whether or not it's worth it, because it's certainly not an easy reform. It will take a lot more paperwork and printing and consulting and carrying on yet, and it's something that they'll just have to decide. Is this worth pursuing in the long run? Parents don't really have very much say at all, other than to say, well, I don't like this, and use their vote. But other than that, it is a top-down reform.
I didn't come here to... Have I got till 7:15, Greg? If I'm... I might need it. I didn't come here tonight with the expectation of disagreeing with Jennifer Buckingham, whose work I've admired over the years for the most part. And I suppose you might also wonder why someone like myself should even have any interest in what's happening to school funding, but I still have 15 reasons for being interested in the matter, and I intend to hope to be long enough to see a few of them complete their schooling. Some mention was made, I think, by the gentleman in front of me who didn't give his name, and therefore I have to refer to him personally, about the word equity. Now, it's naive of me, I know, but bearing in mind, as I say, the families that I'm referring to here, all of them pay taxes. In fact, I think probably on average, I'd be right in saying they pay more than average taxes. And indeed, I think that's as a generalisation, it's not universal, but generalisation, true of all parents sending children to independent schools. They're paying above average levels of taxation. Yet the fact is that funding to independent schools, almost entirely provided by, government funding by the Commonwealth, is far, far below the amount of funding provided to government schools by mainly state governments, and to some extent the Commonwealth government. What on earth is supposed to be equitable about that? I would have thought the only test of equity here ought to be, and I know it's a revolutionary thought in a half-socialised economy, or more than half-socialised economy, is that all children ought to be given, you can call it a voucher system if you like, but I'm not interested in vouchers for this discussion tonight. All children ought to be allocated the same amount of money, whatever school they go to. Distinguishing, of course, between primary schools on the one hand, secondary schools on the other hand, and so on. The usual differences that you're more familiar with than I am. But as to repeat the question, why should that not be the norm or the standard to which we should be seeking to attain? When I first picked up the newspaper and read about the Gonski report and saw this reference to this standard, I thought, Mr. Gonski is maybe going to say something sensible. Then I found that he's only talking about 20% of the standard. Now, I mean, I'm sorry to be, as I say, so naive, but what is wrong with what I'm saying?
Nothing. But there are two. There's two ways you can approach that. If you gave an educational entitlement, let's say, instead of a voucher, of equal value to every child, regardless of their circumstances.
Obviously have to be
Okay.
separately provided for, by which I incidentally don't mean all those people lining up the so-called disadvantages. That's quite a different, much overused word, not the same thing as disabilities.
Okay, yes, I understand. So you could give every child an amount of equal value. Let's call it $10,000, irrespective of their circumstances, irrespective of the school they attend. To me, there's two problems with that. One is the enormous amount of extra public funding that would have to go into education. Way more than $5 billion, I would suspect, or perhaps close to. And that, for me, causes a bit of a conundrum again, because I'm a person who doesn't really like to see private funding supplanted with public funding. And that's what it would do.
I'm not suggesting that should be the case.
Well, that's what would happen.
Parents will still give money to schools if they're happy with the performance of the schools they're going to.
Right, but they're actually also getting extra public funding.
Sure.
Right.
You could, of course, equalise it by reducing the amount being given to government schools.
This is true. That's the other approach. You could say, well, if you want to make it variable in circumstances for everybody across the board in every single school, you need to abandon then the principle of free public education. So you've got a problem on one side, which is a huge amount of extra public funding, which takes over where private investment is currently doing the job. And with that public funding will come extra public obligations. History shows us that that's often the case, that where public funding goes, their state intervention follows. That the more funding you give to a school, the more they want to know what you're doing and what you're spending it on. So there's a bit of a trade-off between independence and public funding. On the other hand, if you make it a variable voucher, let's say, across every school in every sector, then you have to abandon free public education. So this, as I said, is a compromise between those two positions. I'm not happy with the fact that there's a 10% anticipated capacity to pay for every non-government school, regardless of their circumstances. I would like to see the more opportunity for non-government schools to be fully publicly funded. However, as I said, this model is a compromise because of those two dilemmas on either side of the public-private funding equation.
So basically, your objection working out a question of principle, but of the practical difficulty in providing funding.
But it's both. It's principle and practical application, because as I said, I don't see what are the benefits. I mean, there is a principle, yes, everyone agrees that, well, not everyone, but I do agree that in principle people should be entitled to the same level of government funding, particularly when taxpayers, they're entitled to that. However, there is then that problem of exponentially increasing public funding well into the future, where private funding is already doing that job. It would, but you would still... It would still, in the long run though, if I'm not mistaken, still eventually get to the point where you have public funding doing a job that private investment was doing. So one is taking over from the other.
Anyway, look, this could go on till 7:15 as you suggested, John. So I'd like to call things to a halt for now. needless to say, the whole school issue has been part of the CIS from almost day one, simply because, if for no other reason, I was a school teacher and I originally was going to start a school, and I didn't. I started the Centre for Independent Studies instead. So, and if anybody wants to have a long discussion about that, I can tell you all about it. But we're delighted that Jennifer's been with us for so long and been such an active participant in the debate. I mean, internally we've had discussions about the best way of doing this if you're going to do it, and you know, I share some of your concerns and some of the objectives, John, because we've argued about it here about maybe we should make fees deductible fully, or then you. One of the things I've always liked is that E.G. West, the education economist who actually came here some years ago, he talked about a transferable tax credit, so you know anybody could get the credit for educating a child. Could have been the maiden aunt, or if you want to use those terms these days, or the business down the road that is concerned about the education of the children in the neighbourhood could put money into schools and get a credit for it and so forth. So I mean, there are all sorts of other options, but for the moment this is the one that's on the table, and whilst we'd like to sort of keep in mind perhaps a purer and better way of doing it, we have to deal with things as they are and try to sort of make sure they go in the right direction, and Jennifer's not giving up on this, and others in this room who are actively involved in writing about it or talking about it will also no doubt be on the job as well. So thank you again, Jennifer, and thanks to everyone for coming along tonight, and would you please thank Jen for being